It is Thursday afternoon. Michael is 28 years old. He is sitting at his desk on the third floor of a building he does not own, working for a company he does not own, on a computer he does not own. The email arrives at 3:47 in the afternoon. The subject line says, compensation adjustment. Michael opens it. 8% raise, effective next pay period. He does the math in his head, about $300 extra per month. He feels something move in his chest. Relief. The kind of relief that only people who have been quietly tired for a long time know how to recognize. He picks up his phone. He calls his partner. He says the words, "We got the raise." And before the call ends, before the first check has even been deposited, Michael is already thinking about the car. The lease on his current car is almost up. $300 a month is what separates the model he drives now from the next tier up. He does not open a savings account. He doesn't pull up a calculator. He does not sit down and ask one question. He feels the relief, and he spends toward it before the money has touched his account. That decision, made in less than 10 minutes, will erase the next decade of his financial life. He doesn't know that yet. Most people never know it. Most people believe a raise is progress. The data shows something different. For the average American worker, a raise is not income. A raise is a temporary pause before the cost of living quietly expands to swallow it. By the time the next raise arrives, the previous one is completely gone. Not spent on emergencies, not invested, not saved, absorbed. Into a slightly nicer apartment, a slightly newer car, a grocery bill that mysteriously rose, a list of subscriptions that grew by 4. The records are clear on this. The data is consistent. This is not a personal failure. The system was never designed to show this. Most people are not given the wrong result. They are given the wrong map. Nobody showed them. The school never taught it. The employer never explained it. The bank had no reason to mention it. Rich people and broke people are not that different. They work the same hours. They worry about the same things. They want the same things. But somewhere along the way, rich people learned one thing. One simple thing that most people were never told. It is not hard to understand. A 12-year-old can understand it. But most adults never heard it because nobody sat them down and said, listen, here is how this actually works. This video does that. Watch this video until the end. Specifically, stay until the story of Michael and Chris. That is where the numbers appear. Real numbers. That shows exactly how much one 30-second decision made on one Thursday afternoon actually costs. After that story, the decision becomes very simple. Do not skip. Watch in order. The last part only makes sense because of what comes before it. Here is what most people believe about raises. A raise means more money. More money means more progress. More progress means closer to the goal. This is the map most people are handed at age 22. It's not their fault. It is the only map anyone showed them. But the records show something different. Across 40 years of documented income data, a clear pattern appears. The average American receives a 3 to 4% increase every year. That is not a small number. Over a 40-year career, that compounds into something enormous. If raises were kept, the average worker would retire wealthy. Not rich. Wealthy enough. Comfortable. Free. But the average worker does not retire wealthy. The average worker retires worried. So the question becomes, where do all the raises go? Study after study confirms the same answer. Lifestyle expenses rise to match income within 6 months of a raise. 6 months. That is the window. After 6 months, the raise is gone. Not in the sense that the money disappeared. In the sense that the cost of being the person receiving the raise has now risen to match it. The car payment. The rent. The grocery store choices. The number of streaming services. The dinner out on Friday that used to be a treat and is now Tuesday. The vacation that used to be a possibility and is now an expectation. None of this feels reckless. None of it feels wrong. It feels earned. That is the trap. It feels earned. Here is the part nobody teaches. The system the average American works inside is designed to absorb every raise, not by accident, by design. The credit card industry adjusts approval limits to income. The auto loan industry adjusts payment terms to income. The housing market adjusts rent and mortgage tiers to income. The subscription economy adjusts what feels normal to income. Every industry that profits from monthly payments has one job: match the rise, absorb the raise, make the new income feel like the same income, only with a slightly nicer life attached to it. That feeling, the slightly nicer life, is what the entire economy is built around producing. It is not a conspiracy. It is just a fact. That is the gap. Not the gap in income, the gap in information. What comes next explains why this gap never closes on its own. Stay tuned for the next chapter. That is where the mechanism becomes visible for the first time. There is a name for what happens to every raise. The records don't call it that. The studies do not name it, but the pattern is identical in every documented case. Call it the raise drain. The raise drain is the invisible mechanism by which every salary increase is absorbed into higher monthly costs before it can compound. It is invisible. It is automatic. It is permanent. Once a lifestyle expands, it almost never contracts back to where it was. That is the key. Once the apartment is bigger, the apartment stays bigger. Once the car is newer, the car payment stays larger. Once Friday night becomes a $60 dinner, Friday night does not return to a $15 pizza. The lifestyle expands. The lifestyle does not contract. That is the raise drain. Think about a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Water comes in from the top. That is the raise. Water leaves through the hole. That is the lifestyle expansion. Most people see the water coming in. They felt the water coming in. They celebrate the water coming in. What they don't see is the hole at the bottom, because the hole is not in plain sight. The hole is hidden inside the new lease agreement. The hole is hidden inside the upgraded phone plan. The hole is hidden inside the streaming service that auto-renewed. The hole is hidden inside the gym membership that seemed reasonable on the day it was signed. Each individual hole is small. Together, they drain the bucket faster than the water can fill it. 6 months after the raise, the bucket is at the same level it was before, sometimes lower. Look at Michael. 3 weeks after that Thursday afternoon, Michael is sitting in a new car. The seats are heated. The dashboard glows blue at night. It smells the way only a new car can smell. He drives it home from the dealership and parks it on the street outside his apartment. He sits in the driver's seat for a moment before going inside. He thinks, this is what working hard looks like. That sentence is the most expensive sentence Michael will say in his entire life, because the new car payment is not $300 more than the old one. It is $340 more. The insurance went up by $60. The registration on the new vehicle is higher. There is a small monthly fee for the connected services he did not realize was attached. The total is closer to $420 extra dollars per month. His raise was $300. Michael is now bringing home $120 less per month than he was before the raise. He doesn't notice this for almost a year. Because the deposits are bigger now, the bank balance feels healthier on payday. The decline shows up at the end of the month, when the same accounts feel just as tight as they always did. He tells himself it is because of the holidays. He tells himself it is because of a slow month. He tells himself it is because of one bad week. The truth is simpler. The bucket has a new hole in it, and the new hole is bigger than the new water coming in. Most Americans earning $8,000 or more report feeling financially stuck. Read that again. $80,000. A salary that 20 years ago was associated with comfort. A salary that any 22-year-old would describe as success. And the people earning it report feeling stuck. Not poor. Stuck. That word is important. Stuck means the income is rising and the position is not changing. Stuck means the work is getting harder and the runway isn't getting longer. Stuck means the raises keep arriving and the freedom never does. That feeling is not random. That feeling is the raised drain, felt without being named. There is a second mechanism that works alongside the raised drain. It is more subtle. It takes longer to appear. But once it arrives, it is the reason raises stop creating progress entirely. Call it the lifestyle creep ceiling. The lifestyle creep ceiling is the point at which income growth no longer creates financial progress, because costs grow at the exact same rate. Income up 4%. Costs up 4%. Net change, 0. The number on the paycheck increases every year. The number in the savings account does not. That is the ceiling. Most people hit it without ever realizing they hit it. They keep working harder. They keep chasing the next raise. They keep believing the next raise will be the one that finally feels different. It never does, because the ceiling rises with them. Think about a rocket trying to leave the atmosphere. Every year the rocket fires its engines a little harder. Every year gravity gets a little stronger. The rocket is moving. The thrusters are louder. The fuel is burning faster. But the altitude is the same. That is the lifestyle creep ceiling. The engines are working. The fuel is being used up. The altitude is not rising. This is what an entire career of lifestyle absorbed raises looks like. It looks busy. It looks like motion. It is not progress. Look at Michael at age 35, 7 years after that Thursday afternoon. He has received 3 more raises since the first one. His salary is now $68,000. His car is 2 tiers above where it started. His apartment is in a better neighborhood. His grocery store choices are nicer. His weekend plans cost more. His vacations involve flights now, not drives. By every external measure, Michael's life has improved. By every internal measure, Michael feels exactly the same as he did at 28. The same end-of-month tightness. The same Sunday night anxiety about the week ahead. The same quiet feeling that something is supposed to be different by now. His savings account holds about $4,000. It held about $4,000 at 28, too. 7 years. 3 raises. Same number in the account. That is the lifestyle creep ceiling, measured in the only way it can be measured. By what stays. Not by what comes in. By what stays. This is not a personal failure. The system was never designed to make this visible. Nobody sent Michael a chart at the end of the year showing his income up and his net worth flat. The bank does not send that letter. The employer does not send that letter. The school never taught that the two numbers are different. Most people believe a higher salary equals a richer life. The records do not support that belief. The records show something simpler. A higher salary funds a more expensive life. It does not, by itself, fund a richer one. The two are not the same. They have never been the same. But almost nobody is told that out loud. Here is the part most people never consider. The raised drain is not a flaw in the system. The lifestyle creep ceiling is not an accident. The system is working exactly the way it was built to work. The system is not broken. The system is functioning. That is the harder truth. Think about how the consumer economy generates revenue. Every dollar that sits in a savings account is a dollar that is not being spent. Every dollar that pays down debt early is a dollar that is not generating interest payments. Every dollar that goes into investments is a dollar that is not flowing through retail. The economy does not grow when raises are saved. The economy grows when raises are spent. Every industry that touches a working person's monthly budget has one shared interest. Make sure the raise gets spent. Quickly. Repeatedly. Permanently. This is why credit limits rise the moment income rises. This is why car dealerships ask about monthly payment, not total cost. This is why housing tiers are priced at exact percentages of common salary brackets. This is why subscription services are designed to feel small, individually. Each individual transaction is rational. The aggregate effect is the raised drain. 2 roads lead the same starting point. Both roads start at age 22. Both roads start with the same salary. Both roads receive the same raises along the way. One road is paved with marketing, built to absorb every raise into a slightly nicer life. The other road is barely visible. It does not have billboards. It does not have commercials. It does not have a salesperson at the entrance. The first road is easy to find. The second road has been searched for. That is the gap. The gap is not an effort. The gap is in the information. One person learned the second road existed. One person did not. Nothing else was different. Stop here for a moment. Everything in this video so far has been the setup, the raised drain, the lifestyle creep ceiling, the reason the system works the way it does. What comes next is different. This is the part where two real lives, the same age, the same salary, the same city, the same company, begin to separate. Not because of talent, not because of luck, not because of a bigger raise, because of one decision made on one Thursday afternoon that almost nobody was taught to make. Stay. The next 10 minutes are why this video exists. The next story is the most important part of this video. Pay attention here. Michael and Chris are both 28 years old. They work at the same company. They live in the same city. They earn the same starting salary, $48,000 per year. They went to similar schools. They came from similar families. They have similar goals. Both of them receive identical raises every 2 years. The company they work for has a structured compensation system. Same role, same performance, same raise. The only difference between Michael and Chris is one decision. One decision made on the day each raise arrives. That is it. That's the whole story. Michael, as already shown, receives his first 8% raise on a Thursday afternoon. $300 extra per month. He absorbs it. The car, the apartment, the dinners. By month 6, the raise is gone. 2 years later, another raise arrives. Same pattern. 2 years after that, another raise. Same pattern. 2 years after that, another raise. Same pattern. Each new raise funds a slightly nicer life. Each slightly nicer life consumes the new raise within 6 months. By age 35, Michael has received 3 additional raises. His salary is $68,000. His savings account holds $4,000. Chris receives the same first raise on the same Thursday afternoon, sitting at the same kind of desk. $300 extra per month. Chris does something different. Before the first paycheck of the new amount arrives, Chris sets up an automatic transfer. 80% of every raise moved out of checking the moment it deposits. $240 of the $300 moved into a separate account. He keeps $60 per month for himself. That is the only difference. This is the raise lock. The raise lock is the strategy of committing the majority of every raise to savings or debt payoff before the lifestyle expands to consume it. The lock happens before the absorption can begin. It is automatic. It is invisible. It is permanent. By the time Chris's brain registers the raise, 80% of it is already gone from view. His lifestyle does not expand, because his lifestyle never sees the money. At age 35, Chris and Michael earn the same salary, $68,000. Same job, same company, same raises. Michael's savings account holds $4,000. Chris's savings and investment accounts hold approximately $58,000. That is 7 years of locking 80% of every raise and letting the standard market return do its work. Same income, same career, same city. $54,000 gap. The gap is not from a bigger paycheck. The gap is from one decision, repeated 4 times over 7 years. At age 42, 14 years in, both still earning the same. Michael's savings account holds approximately $6,000. Chris's accounts hold approximately $190,000. The compounding has begun. The earlier money has been working longer. The newer raises have joined it. The gap is no longer in dollars only. The gap is now in what each life looks like from the inside. Michael still feels the end-of-month tightness. Chris does not. Michael still feels the Sunday night anxiety. Chris does not. Michael still believes the next raise will be the one that finally feels different. Chris already knows it will not, and has stopped depending on it. At age 55, 27 years after that Thursday afternoon, the two roads have arrived at completely different places. Michael's accounts hold under $30,000. Michael cannot retire. Michael is looking at another 15 years of work, minimum. Chris's accounts hold over $700,000. Chris can stop working whenever he chooses. Chris won't, but he can. That is the difference. Not that one of them retired earlier. That one of them has the option. The other does not. Same salary, same raises, same 40 years. One decision, made on one Thursday afternoon at age 28, repeated automatically every 2 years afterward. That is the entire gap. That is the only difference. This is not motivation. This is what the next 10 years look like, depending on one decision made in the next 10 minutes. Stay for this part. The raise lock is simple. A 12-year-old can understand it. A working adult can implement it in 15 minutes. It does not require a financial advisor. It does not require a complex spreadsheet. It does not require any specialized knowledge. It requires 3 steps. Step 1. Decide the lock percentage in advance. Before the next raise arrives. Not after. Before. The number to commit to is between 50 and 80%. 80% is the version Chris used. 50% is the version that still works for someone with tight existing obligations. Anything below 50% is not a lock. It is a delay. The number must be decided when there is no raise on the table. Because the moment a raise is in hand, every reason to spend it will appear automatically. The decision must be made in advance, when the brain is not under the spell of new money. Step 2. Set up the automatic transfer before the first new paycheck. This is the most important step. The transfer must happen on the same day the deposit lands. Same day. Same hour if possible. The lifestyle expansion begins the moment the larger deposit appears in checking. The transfer must beat that moment. The destination matters less than the timing. A high-yield savings account works. A retirement account works. A debt payment to a credit card works. What matters is that the locked portion leaves checking before the brain has time to plan around it. Out of sight. Out of reach for casual spending. Step 3. Repeat with every future raise without renegotiating. This is the step most people miss. The raise lock is not a one-time decision. It is a permanent rule. Every raise, locked. Every promotion, locked. Every bonus, partially locked. The lock is not revisited. It is not adjusted because of a tough month. It is not reduced because of an unexpected expense. The lock is treated like rent, non-negotiable, automatic, invisible. That's what makes it work. The moment it becomes optional, it becomes the raise drain again. That is the entire strategy. 3 steps. Decided in advance. Automated immediately. Repeated permanently. A 12-year-old can understand it. Most adults were never told it. That's not a personal failure. That's the gap in the information. The gap is now closed. It is 54 years from now. Chris is 82 years old. It is a Tuesday morning. Early autumn. The kind of morning that smells like leaves and quiet. He is sitting on the back porch of a house he owns. There is a cup of coffee on the small wooden table next to him. The coffee is the same coffee he has been drinking for 54 years. He never upgraded it. He never needed to. He is reading a book. He is not in a hurry. There is no email he is dreading. There is no Sunday night feeling that has been stalking him all weekend. There is no end-of-month tightness arriving at the end of this week. There has not been for a very long time. The phone rings. It is one of his grandchildren calling about nothing important. Chris talks for 40 minutes. He has the time. That is the part most people never understand about wealth. It is not the cars. It is not the houses. It is not the vacations. It is the 40-minute phone call on a Tuesday morning that does not have to end because of a meeting. It is the cup of coffee that does not have to be drunk standing up. It is the autumn morning that does not have to be traded for one more shift. At 82, that is what the numbers on the accounts actually mean, not the number itself. The morning. The call. The unhurried Tuesday that belongs entirely to him. Chris thinks about the Thursday afternoon at age 28. The email at 3:47. The 8% raise. The 15 minutes he spent setting up the automatic transfer before the first check arrived. He almost did not do it. He almost let that Thursday slip by, like every other Thursday before it. He thinks about how close he came to becoming Michael. Not because Michael did anything wrong. Because Michael did exactly what almost everyone is taught to do. Feel the relief. Spend toward the relief. Move forward. Chris just happened to hear, somewhere, that there was a different road. He took it. It did not feel heroic at the time. It felt like 15 minutes of clicking through a banking app on a Thursday afternoon. It felt like turning down a slightly nicer car at age 28. It felt like saying no to an apartment upgrade at age 30. None of it felt like the moment everything changed. But it was. 54 years of mornings have followed from that one Thursday. 54 years of raises locked before the lifestyle could absorb them. 54 years of the same automatic transfer running quietly in the background while life went on. The grandchild on the phone does not know any of this. She knows her grandfather is always home on Tuesday mornings. She knows he always has time. She does not know that the time, the unhurried, unworried, unrushed time, was built one Thursday afternoon at age 28. 15 minutes. One decision. 54 years of Tuesday mornings. That is the whole story. That is the only difference. The records show this pattern again and again, in every case. The gap is never in effort. The gap is never in talent. The gap is in one piece of information. Now that information is no longer hidden. The next raise is coming. What happens to it is the only question that matters.